Understanding how to use the Layers panel in Adobe Illustrator will help you find, select, edit, and organize all of your shapes and paths. Now, if you're familiar with working in Adobe Photoshop, forget everything you know because the Layers panel in Illustrator works quite a bit differently. So let's take a look at the Layers panel right now. You'll notice I have two layers, and layers actually sort of do double duty. There's layers and folders because you can have a bunch of different things inside a particular layer, such as an object or multiple objects. You can have paths, multiple paths. You can have groupings. You can have a bunch of different stuff in a layer. In fact, you can even have sublayers inside of layers, and inside those sublayers, you can have a bunch of grouped objects and single path. So it can get really crazy nested hierarchically. But that's part of the beauty of it, is that you can really structure your files as organized as you like. Now, by default, when you open up a blank document, you will always have something called Layer 1. Layer 1 is the first place that your contents will start to go. And unless you add a new layer, everything will go inside of Layer 1. To create a new layer, click on the New Layer button at the bottom of the panel, and you'll notice that it called this new layer Layer 3. So new layers will always go sequentially in order, Layer 1, Layer 2, Layer 3, and so forth, unless or until you rename them. The reason we have Layer 3 is because I had already created a Layer 2, but relabeled it as clipping masks, and my Layer 3 dropped in above Layer 1 because I had Layer 1 selected. A layer that doesn't have any information on it will not have a little triangle, so this area will be completely blank. But a layer that does have contents will show you the triangle, and the triangle is an expand collapse button that toggles the layer open and close. Before we show you what's on Layer 1, let's take a look at these other columns. The first column is for the visibility of the particular layer. And you can see by clicking on that layer, everything that's on Layer 1 is hidden from view. Now you notice that when I have my cursor on top here, it says Control-click to toggle view mode. So let's hold down our Command or Control key and click on that, and you can see that that puts us into outline mode for that layer. Sometimes you may have an object that's hiding behind another object, and the only way you can actually go and grab it is by seeing that little X in its center point and clicking on it, and then toggling back with the Command or Control key right on the visibility icon, going back into preview mode. Now, if you Alt or Option click on a visibility icon, what happens is only the layer that you've selected will be visible, and all other layers in the entire Layers panel will be hidden from view. So just keep those in mind. Command or Control clicking will convert it to outline view, and Alt or Option clicking will hide everything but the selected layer. The next column is whether or not you can modify the objects on a particular layer. So you can toggle off and on a lock icon. When there is a lock icon, you cannot select, manipulate, edit, do anything to a locked layer. And why would you want to lock something down? Well, I'll tell you about that in just a second. This third column here is color-coded layer attribute, so that if you wanted to modify the contents of an object or a group of objects, the color of the layer will be used to create the selection outline for your objects. So the objects on this layer use this particular blue, whereas the objects on my clipping mask layer, if I unlock it and then select this, use the bounding area with that red color. You can change that color at any time, and if you want to modify the properties of a layer, any layer, all you need to do is double-click to open the Layer Options dialog box. Here you can create a name for your layer, and it's a good idea to label these according to the contents. That will help you remember where everything goes. Unless you really plan on only ever using Layer 1, then it doesn't matter that it's called Layer 1. You know where everything is. Here's where you can change the color coding, and you can choose from any of these options. You can now even create a custom color, which is a cool idea. And then here are some options that you can choose from for layers. So layers can be shown or hidden by default, and this controls the visibility icon of the layer. And then layers can be printing or non-printing. So for instance, you may have placed image that's on a locked layer, and that you're using it as a guide to create your drawing, but you do not want that layer to print. You only want your drawing on top of it to print. So you can toggle that off for any particular layer. But by default, presumably you'd want everything to print, so usually leave that on. These are the default settings for any regular layer. Preview is allowing you to preview the objects on your layer, and that's on by default. That's good. And then dim images. If you wanted to, you could dim the images on any particular layer. Why would you want to do that? Because you may want to place some art into your artboard and then create a template layer from it, lock it down, dim the images so you can trace on top, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Let's look now at the rest of the layers panel. When you have a layer that does have contents, you can click on that little triangle to expand. And actually, let me drag this out as a floating panel so we can see everything while we're working. So you can expand and collapse. When it's expanded, you can see all the individual paths and objects on the layer. So these are my text layers, and these are my shape layers. And this is a group of objects, these guys right here. And that can be further expanded to show all of those individual paths. And there's quite a few of them. So this grouped object is essentially a sublayer of layer 1. And I can name that sublayer anything that I want. So these are all editable, though text usually does take on the properties of the text that is on screen. So this one is using the layers panel, and you see the word using. You can select any layer here to open up the dialog box to modify its properties, or clicking right on the word to change the name of it, double clicking. So I might want to call this one green dot. And if I want to open up the properties for that and just type it in here, just double clicking. Here you can also say whether or not it should show and or be locked. And then this last column here has two parts. There is the target, and you can target a particular layer and then drag to move the appearance. So if I'm targeting this layer, then that layer is targeted, and then I can use this little guy to indicate that the artwork is selected. So this is definitely selected. And then if I wanted to reposition it within the layer, all I would have to do is click and drag to reposition. So maybe I want to put that on top of the green button. So you just drag and drop to reposition the order of the selected targeted layer. If you want to create a sub-layer within an existing layer, you won't click this button because that's for creating a new layer. You'll click this one. Now this button is only active when you're inside a selected layer. So now we can create a sub-layer, and we can call it whatever we want. Anytime you don't want a layer or a sub-layer, you can select it and click your little mini trash icon. In the options menu for the layers panel are options to create new and sub-layers, duplicate any selections, or even delete selections. So if we had something selected, say, we could target that object and say delete or duplicate the path. Just going to undo that. You could also look at the options for any particular selection if that is an option that's available to you. So these things that are grayed out are always context specific. We can't enter isolation mode because we're dealing with a single path. But if you have a grouping, once you enter isolation mode, you can then exit isolation mode. And if there were subgroups within your group, you could enter isolation mode again or exit one step at a time. You could also make clipping masks, look at the options for the group, and also access the panel options. So just keep in mind that the panel's options menu is context specific and will only give you the options that are available depending on what you have or don't have selected. You can flatten your artwork, although I would not recommend that you flatten your artwork on your original file that has all the paths and everything in it. If anyone ever asks you to flatten an Illustrator file, please make a copy of it, do file save as. Let's say your original file is abc.ai. Call it abc_flatten.ai. Then flatten that version and give the person the flattened version. Do not flatten your original because invariably you're going to need to go back in there and make some changes. You could, if you were going to do some animation, like maybe bring some things into Flash, you could create a bunch of artwork on a single layer and then release layers to sequence or release layers to build and that will put all of the individual objects and paths onto their own layers, which you could then bring into Flash as layered objects, and that could help you in assembling your animation there. If you want, you can have a layer selected and convert it into a template. Here's where you could do those little keyboard shortcut things like hide all the others, or outline all the others, or unlock all the others. And this feature here is also really helpful. So let's say, for example, you created a picture of a dog, but you put the dog parts on different layers. So you have a layer for the dog's head, and a layer for the dog's torso, another layer for the dog's arms and legs, and one more layer for the tail. And you want to retain all of those separate layers as you copy your dog from one document to another. If Paste Remembers Layers is turned on, when you copy and paste into the new document, all those special layers will come in with the paste. If Paste Remembers Layers is deselected, then all of those objects, even though they were on separate layers before, will get pasted into a single layer. So that could also be something that you would want, but just pay attention to that and know that that's a feature that you can toggle on or off. And once it's on, it'll stay on unless you turn it off again, and vice versa. Let's talk now about placing artwork. Sometimes you may want to place artwork into your document so that you can trace it. One thing people do a lot is they bring photographs into Illustrator and then create these locked template layers and then trace on top of them to give you sort of this caricature of a person. To place art into your document, go to the File menu and choose Place. And I have some artwork that you can use here. You'll grab the butterfly this time. And that's a little bit large, so let's shrink it down. And we'll move it over here. So there's some placed artwork. Now, if I want my butterfly on its own layer, like let's say layer 3, and I'm just going to call that butterfly. And then I want to move that selected object, and you can see that it's selected here. It's called Placed. It's targeted. It's selected. If I want to move it, all I have to do is click and drag. And notice that the blue is changing to green because this layer has a green color. So now I've successfully moved my butterfly to a new layer. Now I can lock it down like this, or I can double click on the layer to show my layer options. And here I can turn it into a template. Templates are automatically locked layers, so I didn't need to put the lock there before I came in here to make it a template. And it also turns dimming on, but it turns printing off. You could adjust the dim, and I wish there was a preview here so you could see what it looks like before you click OK. But if you want to adjust the dim, you'd have to come back in. Now, I think 50% is pretty good, but depending on the level of detail in your placed image, you may want to increase or decrease that amount. So now we have a locked template layer, and you can see visibly it's different. It's a template layer, it's visible, but it's at 50% visibility. It's locked, and the name of it is now italicized, which is another visual cue that this is not a regular layer. Now, if we want to draw on top of it, we would need a new layer on top of it to draw. Or we could drag that whole layer below layer 1, like so, and then we could draw on layer 1. So let's do that. We'll grab our pen tool, and then we can start to draw with layer 1 selected around the outside of our butterfly shape. Now, right now I'm drawing with and I'm not going to worry about perfect precision or accuracy. I'm drawing with a fill and no stroke. And sometimes when you're doing this, the stroke actually hides what it is that you're trying to draw. And so you might need to just draw with a stroke and no fill, and then go back and change it after you've closed your shape. Like right there, I can't see what's going on in here, but I might want to curve this in. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to close my shape, and then I can come back in and modify the path to match the template a little bit better. Like so. The last thing I want to show you is a feature called clipping masks. And I've isolated 2 bits of artwork on a single layer so that I can show you how this works. Because if you want to do a clipping mask, it works best if the objects are on their own isolated layer. So to show you how to use this feature, I'm going to toggle off the lock icon. And what I'm going to do is put the star on top of the lotus. Now I have that layer selected, and those are the only things on that layer. And then actually I can, let me grab my regular black arrow here. Grabbing both, I can choose Make Clipping Mask. And what that does is it uses the shape of the star to mask or hide away everything outside the boundaries of that star shape. So it's a clipping mask. It's clipping away anything behind it, and the shape can be any shape. These two objects are editable by going into your isolation mode. So you can select the object or the shape, either way. Now I've selected the placed water lily. So if I want to go back to my clipping group, I would have to come here. Then I could select my star. Now notice this little button up at the top here. I'm in the clipping group, and these are only there when I'm in the clipping group. The first button is to edit the clipping path, and the second button is to edit the contents of the path. So that was selected so that we could only try and adjust the lotus flower itself, or the other way, which would be to adjust the star and where the image falls relative to the star. So you might want to toggle between those so that you can make modifications to them. And then, of course, with this selected, you could go in with your white arrow and you can manipulate the size and shape of the star. Everything's infinitely editable in Adobe Illustrator. To exit out of isolation mode, remember, just click this little button here and you're back to the way you were.